I think the most important thing to start with when you're housing cattle is to start with healthy cattle, which means having your health program organised before you actually house and think about it well beforehand. What you really want coming into the shed is cattle that are not carrying things like Who's pneumonia with them, or Who's because it actually tends to facilitate the development of pneumonia indoors. I think the next most important thing when you come inside is you want a healthy environment, a shed with plenty of air, where the air outlet is twice the air inlets available as such. That's quite important, especially with good stocking densities and so on. And equally, stocking density is important to keeping the shed clean. I think the next most important thing that farmers must always consider is the silage itself, an analysis of the silage, and look at it both qualitatively and quantitatively so that you know what you have, you know how you know what it'll take to balance it protein wise and otherwise, how much it will take to feed with it, and also to space it out correctly over the winter so that you don't, at any time run out of silage. It's better to balance it and make sure you have enough all the time than actually run short. All those parts are quite important. In balancing the silage, then there's a few things that are also important, is that your energy sources come from maybe different sources, and your protein sources, at least 2 sources of energy in the feed you're feeding, at least 2 sources of protein, and spread the starch and things and the energy between starch sources and fibre sources, and spread the protein in terms of degradability as well. All quite important to just getting the balance right at the end of the day. Just as a few rules of thumb on silage quality, I think DMD is still a critical factor. It's been talked about since the 1960s, and it's as important now as it was then. Every single drop you take of 1 unit of digestibility will cost you about 0.4 kgs of concentrate to compensate for it. Or to put it another way, every 5 units of DMD you drop, you can take it at a constant level of feeding of concentrate. It'll drop your performance by about 0.2 kilos a day for every 5 units drop in digestibility. So it's critical that you get that part of it right. Diet balancing will mean different things to different farmers depending on their circumstances. If you're simply feeding feed or silage with a concentrate feed or a coarse ration, it can mean picking the appropriate one to balance that and match that. In the case of the farm we were on here, he was using complete beef, for example, with the bulls. On the other hand, he's using fast finisher with the steers, where a lower protein requirement is required. If it was a situation where you had a good bit of homegrown fodder, let's say fodder beet, barley, things like that, treated or not is irrelevant from a balancing point of view for the moment. But the important thing there is that all of them are taken into account, and particularly that they're balanced to avoid metabolic risks. Things like acidosis in particular is a big problem on farms. That really causes performance loss. And I have found farms where they should be performing at 1.7 a day and we're getting enough energy to do that, but because of acidosis and subclinical acidosis, we're performing more like 1.2 a day. That kind of a scenario across the winter in a bull finishing operation would leave you short, literally, close to €200 per head over the winter period. Margin that you can't afford to lose. So optimum performance means avoiding those kind of imbalances. And the same applies to protein. It must match the animal type. Bulls will need higher protein than steers. Steers will require more than heifers. Heifers will require more than cull cows. So it's a question of matching what you're putting in front of them to the animal type as well. When it comes to feed additives, it's very important to use additives to improve diet efficiency. I divide additives into 2 categories. Firstly, there are additives that improve performance, and there are additives that are purely added to compensate for bad balancing of the diet, basically to prevent acidosis risk and things like that. Things that straw can do quite effectively if used correctly, or correct diet balancing can use, and avoiding starch overload and so on. So those kind of additives give you no performance improvement. They might give you an apparent performance improvement, but really it's a performance that you should have got anyway beforehand. It's just that you're compensating for the deficiency. On the other hand, there are a number of additives that actually improve how the animal uses the feed that it actually gets. And that's really where you need to go with additives. In general, additives certainly can be recommended, and quite a lot of them give a very high return on investment. And generally, as you get into more intensive production, and particularly bull beef, the higher the density of the diet and so on, the better the return you get on the additive. With regard to animal performance, people often ask, what is possible? And I think I kind of divided in my own head as a rule of thumb. I always say from 0.9 to 1.9 is my range of performances. The 1.9 is at the very top end of intensive bull finishing, particularly with bulls that are 7-8 bred continentals, Charolais and Limousin crosses, those good orange and white ones that are very common coming down from the west and other places like that where there's a tradition of suckling. They can perform at up to 1.9. If I was to move down from there, then we can get up to 1.7 on the steer equivalent, 1.5 on the heifer equivalent of those good continental steers. When we get into Frisian bullocks and particularly those off the dairy yard started by Hereford and Angus, we're more back to a limitation of about 1.3. If we get into their heifer equivalent, particularly Angus Hereford cross heifers, a lot of those will be at 1.1. And on the other hand, if we go into the small dairy crosses with Jersey and New Zealand Frisian in the background, we're more down at 0.9. And in addition to the performance gap, what you will find is the better shaped animals, because they kill out better, more of your weight gain at all times goes towards the carcass. So that actually reduces the cost of carcass gain. When you go to the martyr course, you pay somewhat for that advantage because of the better shape of the animal. And if you compare today, a good O plus with a fat score of 3 versus a U plus with a fat score of 3, you have a 300 plus gap in the factory, maybe up to 330, 340, 350, depending on who you're dealing with and so on. And that obviously is something that you cannot pay more than that for in the mart either. It's not always the best cattle leave the best margin. It's not always the cheapest one leaves the best margin either. It's down to performance at the end of the day and the amount of weight gain you can put on and the cost of putting that weight gain on from the time the cattle come in until they're hung up, basically. I think it's always important when cattle come indoors, and this is, I suppose, the time to focus on it, to remember the basics, starting with stocking density in the sheds, the number of times that feed is put in, how often it's put in, how clean the water system is. Water is particularly important. Water has a big impact on dry matter intake, and particularly with dry diets, it's crucially important that animals have a volume of water. And you will see quite oftentimes with small drinking bowls shared between pens, it's simply not enough. And they will need to have access to a reservoir of water, some kind of a trough system where they can actually drink as they require. And stocking density is obviously something to bear in mind there as well. Everything you do, I think, is about doing it gradually. Introduction of ration, do it gradually. Withdrawal of ration, do it gradually. Increasing, feeding rates or changing feeding rates or changing from one system to another, do it gradually. But I think the most important thing of all in housing situations is to have a kind of a transition system. So when the cattle come in first, particularly where you're buying in, and more particularly where you're buying in weanlings, that they have a transition phase, that they have a safe diet for the first period before you push them upwards, that they're not as densely stocked at the beginning, and maybe the protein content of the diet should be curtailed a little bit at the beginning as well to reduce sweating and so on. So they're the simple management things, small things done well and done consistently every day, including feeding them at the same time every day.